Good morning. This is John Heinrich again. What I want to talk to you now is about leadership in small businesses. The reason I call it leadership in small businesses is because, frankly, that's the reason we launched the school and the reason we did the School of Entrepreneurship in the first place. Small business is the heartbeat of America. It's not big business. It employs more people and it drives the economy. But one of the problems has always been lack of leadership in small businesses. Now, what I want to do is run through some principles of leadership that I think pertain to small business. And you can disagree or disagree if you wish. Our phone line is always open. But let's start with this. First of all, when you start a business, let's assume for the moment that you've taken our other courses or you've intuitively got your business positioned correctly and everything seems to be going along swimmingly. And maybe you're operating out of your garage or operating out of your bedroom, but that's okay. We don't fault that. You don't have to go out and lease a big building right at the outset anyway. But when you're starting your business, you don't necessarily need any leadership because you know what you're doing. And even after you've hired up to about 5 employees, you don't need any leadership because they know you're the boss. They will follow whatever you do. Now, what you do have a responsibility to do is to keep the company going and growing. And otherwise, the employees will be unhappy and might leave. You also have a responsibility to listen to your employees because a lot of them will come up with good ideas, believe it or not. But there's a limit defined by chaos, for example, as to what you can tolerate on new business. Now, the way I used to handle it, and some of my clients have handled it, is this solicitation of new ideas is on Friday afternoon or whenever things are slow, pull everybody together in your conference room or any large space that you've got and just talk over how the business is going, where you see it going, and open it up to questions from your employees. And you will get questions and you have to answer them honestly and truthfully. Because if you're not honest and truthful with your employees, they will think less of you and they might even leave. Odds are they won't because they probably need the job, but they might. And you don't want quiet quitters working for your company. So be careful of your leadership up until probably 5 employees. And then after that, it becomes more of an issue, say till probably 10 or 20 employees. And you hire your first supervisory people, maybe at 10 people. It depends on the type of business you run to some extent, because if you're doing line manufacturing, that line will run probably with 5 to 10 employees and run by itself. And it needs a line leader and you need to lead the line leader, but that's all it needs and it'll go by itself. We know, having had clients doing that, and it doesn't require a lot of supervision unless you run into production problems or quality control problems, at which point you have to exercise your leadership. Now, when you get to about somewhere between 10 and 15 or 20 employees is when leadership becomes more pronounced and the need for leadership becomes more pronounced because people will still look to you as the founder of the business as the leader. Even if you bought the business, you having bought the business will still be looked at to lead the business. And you know that you'll be looked at because that's why you bought the business in the first place, is to lead something. Although I will say there's a major caveat because a lot of people will buy a business just to guarantee a source of income and they're not really interested in growing the business or even particularly leading the business. I encounter this all the time. So that's not what we want you to do, because the title of our school is the Small Business Success School. Emphasis on success, and it is a school. because we are schooling you in the techniques that we know have worked over the years for small businesses. So the question becomes, let's say 20 employees, what kind of a leader should you be? Now, in today's environment, generally speaking, since you've got the last vote as the leader of the company or the owner even of the company, if you have a partner, you might even be the majority partner. You might be even the minority partner under some circumstances, but you're leading the company, so people will defer to you in what you want to do in terms of leading the company. Then you have to start developing a leadership style. Now, the one that has worked for practically all of my clients is somewhere between an authoritative and a coaching leadership style. And there's another one that I like called situational leadership. Now, we developed it in the Navy because sometimes we didn't have enough time to really discuss what needed to be done to complete the mission. And I, as the leader, had to make some snap decisions on what needed to be done. And some of them turned out well, some of them turned out poorly. But as people have said, lead, follow, or get out of the way. I think that was General Patton. And I've always subscribed to that. So you as the leader will be looked to either make that decision or solicit other ideas that people may have in which direction the company should go. For example, one of the things we discovered a durable metal coating other than chrome for exhaust parts in my company. And our first reaction was, holy shit, this could be really big. So at the same time, we were very deliberative about introducing it to the market because we didn't want it to flop. And it couldn't have flopped if we hadn't been very careful in the testing. And as it results, the product just kind of took off without a lot of urging from us. And it had tremendous word of mouth. Now, as a leader, you're kind of like dealing with a controlled crash because you know the stuff is flying out the door and you just want to maintain quality. But as a leader, you could have easily lost control of the process and messed up the product launch of what turned out to be something like 25% of our sales at the time I sold the company. So as a leader, you have to oversee your whole product development process. And this is the lifeblood of your company, because if you're going to grow the company, then you need to do that. Now, even if you're a caretaker and you're just buying yourself a job where you don't have to report to anybody, you still have to be a leader to some extent in order to keep the company on an even keel, because competitors are nasty folks, and there are and will be forevermore competitors out there for you, whether it's retail or wholesale. It doesn't make any difference. They will show up and they will make your life miserable. And if you don't best them through coming up with better products or better services, they will eventually force you out of business, and you won't be the leader. In fact, you might even be in court for having screwed things up. Your employees, believe it or not, might sue you. And I say that sitting here in Arizona, which is not particularly labor friendly, having guided a couple of clients to the labor court after a couple of employees sued them. So, and it was a result of poor leadership in both cases that they got sued. So here's something else to consider. Now, so you need to develop a leadership style, and eventually that leadership style will translate into a company culture. My particular company culture was flat out in fifth gear all the time. And people needed to have that as an expectation when they signed on, because if they weren't able to keep up with that, we didn't want them as employees. And my partner bought into it. I bought into it. If anything, he was kind of the restraining flywheel on me to keep us within our financial resources, which again, I, as a leader, since my name was on the side of the building, it was my responsibility to keep things on a sort of even keel. Now, another thing, which is a derivation of the Friday afternoon bull sessions with your employees, is a more organized process, which I used to do periodically about once a year, is known as a 360-degree survey. Now, that is meant to solicit any problems or questions that people might have in your leadership. And you can do it in a small company because you might only be dealing with 25 to 50 employees. Easy to do. I even used to do it among our sales force, and our sales force was all over the place, nationally and even internationally. And in fact, they were usually my severest critics and came up with a number of new product ideas. But to get back to the 360-degree survey, just look it up. It's a fairly simple questionnaire that's distributed to all employees that says basically, how am I doing? And you might say on personality, leadership, are you happy with the direction of the company? If not, what would you do differently? If you are happy, that's good. What could we do better? And you as a leader of a small business have to be sufficiently confident to indulge in that sort of thing. We have not done it a lot in our clients because by and large, they have had, excuse me, enough employee confidence in their leadership so they don't necessarily have to do it. We encourage it, but many of them just simply don't feel comfortable doing it, and it is what it is. Yes, they may be handicapping their growth somewhat by not doing it, but there it is. Now, one other thing, a major field of leadership is if you buy a business, as I did for my first entrepreneurial venture outside of Ford, don't do anything. The first thing you need to do is nothing for the first 90 days or so until you get a sense of exactly what you bought, because you can look at the financials. You can say, okay, this looks good. The price looks good. The prior owner is willing to sell it to you, and everything is hunky-dory. But you have a bunch of people that you just acquired, and you don't know what their capabilities are because you can't, as a leader, measure that necessarily from the outside, and the prior or then owner may restrict you from actually talking to these people before you've actually signed on and bought the company. So, as I say, don't do anything for the first 90 days unless you're forced to do something, and then go with whatever you think the right course of action was. Now, as it turned out, because even when I bought my family company, my culture in running the company was much different than my father's culture in running the company. And as a result, I had something like 60 or 70% employee turnover in my first year. We were fortunate to replace all the employees with better employees that were more culturally suited, but you have to be aware that that might be a problem. And you might get very familiar with our course on how to hire the right people, because it was quite apparent to me that I didn't have the right people on the bus, and we needed to have that happen before we could go forward with where I saw the company going. Because when you buy a company, you will have a vision for what you want to do with it. And if you've done your homework and you've taken our courses, you know how you're going to either buy yourself a job, in which case all of what I've said is less important. But if you want to take the company forward, as I did, in 7 years, we practically tripled sales. That required a lot of very aggressive people. And I used to say that when I gave raises fairly lavishly, but always with a purpose. We used to say that we kept 10% of their effort for the company and we gave them 10%, pretty much on an annual basis. And occasionally we would, particularly people who had done something notable, we would either give them a cash award or another 10% raise. And it wasn't uncommon for people to experience a 30 to 40% raise in a year working for our company. But these were what we would regard as high potential employees. So when does this stop? It doesn't stop until you sell the company. Now, in my case, I actually burned myself out and I literally sold my interest after 7 years to my business partner. And he kind of normalized things, slowed down, and he owned it for 12 years and he grew probably from 4 million to about 6 million, which is a much lower growth rate. And that was fine. The company needed that. That was just his style, and he was willing to buy it, and I appreciated it. In fact, it's interesting because after he ran it for, I think, 12 years, then he got tired of it. He didn't burn himself out, but he was nearing retirement age, and he wanted to go fishing over in Lake County. He and his wife owned a nice little cabin over there, and he went into retirement, well deserved, because he probably worked for 50 years at that point, and he was ready to retire. So he sold it to Lubrizol, which is a big manufacturer of specialty chemicals. Exactly why they bought it, I'm not too sure, but it wasn't my privy at that point to really question what was going on. It was Kenny's decision to make, and he made it and pocketed a couple of $1 million, which was probably still a bargain. And off he went into retirement. And the company is still known as Xair and as a division of Lubrizol. It's gone more into specialty chemicals rather than exhaust and air intake parts, but that's okay. They bought it. They can do what they want with it. So the bottom line of this leadership talk is that you have to trust yourself to be a leader. Your leadership style will develop over time based on what's comfortable for you. And I like to say, I really thank the Navy for helping me develop my leadership style, because I got thrown into a situation where I was captaining a surveillance plane over Vietnam as a Navy lieutenant, and I had somewhere between 18 and 20 people working for me, all of whom were smarter than I was. But the Navy has made me an officer, and I was the natural or unnatural leader of these 20 souls. So I had to learn to get the best out of them. And that's what evolved my leadership situation, because when I started in the Navy, I had been one of the screamers because that's what the Navy at that time taught. But I discovered that leadership style was not going to work on these people because they were all smart and they knew what they were doing, and they just needed somebody to kind of coach them that they were doing the right thing, or they were doing what they think they saw. Or we had to encourage very free thinking, and it turned out to be very successful. We got the Navy unit commendation, so it worked. Now, that was an unusual situation, but the point is that I evolved my leadership style over a period of years or year on that particular deployment. And even 20 years later, when I was on Navy Reserve duty, courtesy of the good Senator McCain, he rounded up enough money to sponsor myself and another Navy captain to write a book on what the Navy leadership should be, because he thought the Navy had too many mid-level managers and not enough pure leaders, and the growth in the Navy had to come from the pure leaders. So what we did, which was kind of instructive, is because you think of the armed services, you think of the oorah, yell, scream, and they all fall into line. Well, it turned out that the most successful Navy commands, and we surveyed, I think, about 50 of them, as I recall, use somewhere between an authoritative and a coaching style of leadership. In other words, the officer corps knew who was ultimately in charge, but they had to get the best out of their people. And the way to do that was a coaching style so that they understand how to get the best out of themselves. And this is in the Navy intelligence community, which is a bunch of bright people. So even the Navy came up with what was basically a modified coaching style as being the most successful kind of leadership. So we hope you take that to heart. And the first lesson is develop your own style, whatever it is. And if it works and your company grows and people follow you, that's what you need. But be aware that you may have to change it over time as your company grows and even as you grow, as you get smarter on leadership. I mean, I got smarter as I went along in the Navy, and after 6 commands, we pretty much had it down so we knew what worked. And we found out when we did the leadership survey that it not only worked for us, it worked for other commands in the Navy. And the Chief of Naval Operations actually codified it into a book, which he distributed to every command in the Navy. I wish I had a copy of it, but somewhere it's gotten lost to the ages, I think, when I had a robbery several years ago. Anyway, the point of it is that develop your own style. You can tell if it works if you're accomplishing what you want to do for the company. My father was content to kind of let things roll along because he'd started the company in a garage, literally, and build it to the point where it was a nice, successful 15-employee company, yielding he and my mother a very nice lifestyle. Now, when I came out of Ford, I had much different ideas because number one, I had to pay off a note, Kenny and I did, to my father, which was substantial, so we had to grow. And fortunately, we knew how and where we wanted to grow. The fact that we were so successful in product innovation was kind of a bonus. It made us get to where we wanted to get faster. But it took a certain amount of leadership to determine, okay, we're ready to go. Let's introduce it. Go to truck shows, send it to all the salesmen around the world, and sit back and watch the questions come in and the product fly out the door, which it did literally. So again, this takes leadership. This is what we wanted to do. It made me happy up to a point, and I was just until I was working 80 hours a week, and when I was even in the country. And my own leadership style probably got me in trouble. Now, I try to coach my clients to stay out of trouble and not burn themselves out, but we have had cases where people have burned themselves out. And even now, we coach people to stay away from that because I can notice the signs of burnout in some of my company clients. Now, the other major thing that you have to do in leadership is if you have a family company, and a lot of businesses are family companies, you have to pass it off to the next generation successfully, which means you have to sell it. It's not a good idea generally to give it to your offspring because they might screw it up. But if you sell it to them where they've got to pay you money, whether you need the money or not is not the point. Then you have to coach them up to run the company successfully so they can pay you the money. And there's a lot of satisfaction in knowing that something you built is still going 30 years after you sold it. And, that's nice to know. Anyway, and many of my client companies are going, some of them are on the second or third generation. And they're presumably going off and doing great things. Because if they weren't, we'd probably hear about it. So you as a leader have to, if you want to perpetrate your culture, and there's no reason why you wouldn't, if you're the usual egomaniac entrepreneur, you want to perpetrate your culture, you want to see your company thrive and go into the next millennium or the next generation or whatever successfully. So you have to train your successors and then at the right time reach an agreement, which can be contentious, about selling them the company. And in fact, I had actually the third generation of one of my clients had a certain gleam in his eye the last time I saw him. He said, as of July 1st, I finally own all the company. And that's good. You know, he's the third generation. He's the youngest of 5 children and running the company. All of the other 4 are all involved in the company. And that's interesting because it's a great lesson in corporate dynamics because they can all get along. Because they're all dedicated to the same thing, making the company successful. But even Chris, is the youngest, is dedicated to the same thing. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions about leadership at any point in time, do give us a call, 480-200-5678. And thank you for listening.